Hey, MPCers. In this video, we're going to continue to talk about the 1920s. In the last video, we left off with Prohibition, and we're going to pick up this video talking about that clash of cultures. This one, the monkey trial, is going to be about the clash of traditional religious America, fundamentalism, versus new modern scientific America. And so we're going to talk about this trial called the Scopes trial, which is commonly referred to as the monkey trial. There's a great old black and white movie called Inherit the Wind that's about this trial, if you're interested. And so this trial takes place in Tennessee. Tennessee had something called the Butler Act, and the Butler Act basically prevented schools from teaching evolution in schools. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, wanted to test this law out and see how it would hold up in court. And so they needed a teacher to kind of volunteer. And that teacher was John Scopes. And so Scopes volunteered to kind of be with the ACLU to challenge this case. Scopes wasn't even a biology teacher. He was just subbing in biology one day, and he actually couldn't even remember if he actually taught evolution or not, but they used him in the trial just to test the law out. And in fact, he didn't even testify during the trial because he couldn't remember if he taught it or not. So we had two famous lawyers come in, big swinging lawyers, Clarence Darrow, who's a very famous lawyer at the time period who was fighting for like labor rights, for example. And then another guy you guys know, Clarence Darrow, is going to be the defense, like defending John Scopes for teaching evolution. And then another guy you guys know is William Jennings Bryan. That was the Cross of Gold speech guy. He's the guy that ran for president as a populist, ran for president several times and lost the Cross of Gold, populist, but also Secretary of State during World War I. He is now going to be a lawyer for the prosecution and defend the Bible, basically, in this court case. And so he's actually going to die just shortly after this trial is over. This is kind of like his last hurrah here. And so it's a tiny little town in Dayton, Tennessee, and nobody really should have cared about this case. But eventually, because these big, huge lawyers being brought in, it became like this national media circus, which is why they call it the monkey trial, partly because of the evolution thing, but also the media circus. People were literally waiting in line to get tickets to be able to get inside the courthouse. And all these reporters flocked from around the nation to cover what was happening in the Scopes trial. And the Scopes trial, eventually, the highlight of the trial is when William Jennings Bryan, the lawyer for the prosecution, took the stand as a witness, as an expert on the Bible. And then Clarence Darrow basically questioned him about the validity of the Bible and fundamentalism. Fundamentalists believe like word for word everything in the Bible. And it actually made a lot of the fundamentalists in America look kind of silly and ignorant, like that they really believe Jonah was swallowed by a whale. And they literally believe that. And they question about like the age of the earth and those kinds of things. And so that was kind of like the highlight of the trial, the two lawyers battling it out over the Bible. Eventually, John Scopes lost the trial. He was fined $100, but eventually appealed it and he never had to pay for it. So he lost the trial. However, it was science that won out. This huge media national circus made traditional, like religious America, fundamentalists in America, there's John Scopes, it made them look somewhat silly. And so, yes, he lost the trial, but modernity won out. So you have modernity versus fundamentalism, and modernity is going to win out. Scientific America is going to progress, and like traditional fundamentalist religious America seems like uneducated and backwards. And so that's one of those culture clashes there. Here's kind of that media circus of people gathering around, which is part of the reason it's called the monkey trial. And still today in the South, there's a clip from Inherit the Wind. Still today in the South, some states require biology textbooks to put a warning label in the front of the book that warns people that this teaches about evolution. Another big thing about the 1920s is the rise of the consumer culture. We saw a little bit of this in the Progressive Era, and this is eventually going to be something that leads to the Great Depression. And so a lot of Americans during this time period, you want to compete with your neighbors. We have all these new cool things, refrigerators and washing machines and vacuums and toasters and radios and new cars and Model Ts. And so people want to buy all these things, but oftentimes Americans didn't have the money to purchase it. The rich in the 1920s got richer, but the poor people kind of stayed the same. And so they couldn't afford to buy all these products. So a lot of them did it on credit. And this is where we really start to see the beginning of America's credit problem. And so we see that Americans are buying up like Henry Ford's Model Ts, over 23 million cars on the road, one car for every 5 people. 80% of all the cars in the world were right here in America. And Henry Ford was pumping out a Model T every 10 seconds. And when the auto industry booms, so do all the other industries, right? The glass industry booms, the steel industry booms, the petroleum industry booms, the rubber industry booms. And so a lot of the American economy, and even today, is based off the auto industry. If the auto industry is booming, then like a lot of American industry is booming as well. If the auto industry starts to fail, the American economy starts to fail. And we see that with the Great Depression. One of the first companies to start to go in the Great Depression is going to be the auto industry. In 2008, when we had our last big recession, the auto industry was one of the first ones to go. And so also because it's tied into so many other sectors, it creates like this stranglehold over the American economy. It's becoming less and less nowadays, but it is still an important factor there. And so we have over 4 million jobs, or almost 4 million jobs, tied to like the auto industry and the different factories that produce things for the auto industry. Like I said, Henry Ford's perfecting that assembly line, pumping out a Model T every 10 seconds on the assembly line. And eventually, we're not 2-car families yet. In America today, we're like 2-car, 3-car families. Back then, just one Model T was enough. And so he's actually going to start to overproduce, because by the end of, there's Henry Ford there, by the end of the 1920s, Americans don't need 2 or 3 cars. And so he's producing all these Model Ts, but eventually there's not going to be customers to buy them. There's the assembly line there getting pushed through with the cars. And so Hoover, who's going to be the president right before the Great Depression, he exclaimed, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of this land." The 1920s was absolutely booming economically, especially for the upper class. The poor people pretty much stayed the same, but for the upper class, it really was like the roaring 20s. We were producing more things than any other country in the world. We were buying more things than the country in the world, but we were buying it on credit. We were buying it with money we didn't have, which is eventually going to lead to the crash in the Great Depression. A couple other quick topics here. Oops, sorry, my presentation just started over there. A couple other quick topics here. We're going to talk about the return of kind of the Gilded Age, the return of laissez-faire. So we talked about this kind of progressive era with Roosevelt and Taft, and then Wilson was a Democrat. And then we get Republicans, 3 Republicans in a row throughout the 1920s. And they're going to be returning to this era of the Gilded Age of laissez-faire government. They feel like the progressive era did too much. So we had these 20 years of progressive presidents that are getting really, really involved in the government. So we went from the Gilded Age, no government control, to the progressive era, very heavy government control, World War I, even more government control, to finally in the 1920s with Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, okay, the government needs to take a step back. And let's go back to those days of the Gilded Age. In fact, Harding, his slogan when he ran for president was "Return to normalcy." What is normalcy? Normalcy is before the progressive era, back to the Gilded Age, when the government really didn't play a big role here. Harding himself, his administration was known for scandals. We have the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. He was actually the first cabinet member to ever be convicted. He was taking bribes, and it was called the Teapot Dome scandal. We had this land in like Wyoming, for example, that had oil on it that the Navy controlled, and then we didn't need it anymore, so they were like selling it off to oil manufacturers or oil drillers. And so basically he took bribes from these oil companies, like, who am I going to sell it to? And he got caught. He got sent to prison. He was the first cabinet member to ever be sent to prison. There's the Teapot Dome scandal there. And so Harding's administration is known for a lot of corruption, even though he himself wasn't really involved. His Ohio boys, as they were called, he's from Ohio, they were the ones, his friends who he put in these jobs, were doing it, doing the corruption underneath him. Now, Harding actually ends up dying in 1923, and Calvin Coolidge takes over. He's known as Silent Cal. He didn't like to talk. He didn't even, it's said that a reporter like made him a bet. "I bet you I can like make you say more than 3 words. And he simply responded, "You lose." Calvin Coolidge, his famous line is, "The business of America is business." This is that Gilded Age style. Just let business do what business is going to do. The government should not control it. Let's be hands off. Calvin Coolidge is known for things like, he's not known for much, but he's known for things like Mount Rushmore, for example. He went out to South Dakota and basically visited South Dakota, and they trapped him. He loved fishing, and so he spent several months in South Dakota, and he'd go fishing in the morning and catch a bunch of fish, and then go back to like his hotel, and then like the people in South Dakota would restock the ponds with fish. The next morning he'd go out, catch tons of fish, and they'd restock the pond again, and he loved it so much that he stayed there for several months, and eventually they kind of trapped him out there in the Black Hills to get his permission to start building Mount Rushmore, which is just a giant tourist trap now. And so that's exactly what he did. He gave them permission to start building Mount Rushmore because he fell in love with South Dakota, but he's really not known for a whole lot there. And so we also start to see kind of this return to isolationism in the 1920s. In World War I, we got dragged into it, but we didn't really want to be part of World War I. And so a lot of people, after the debate over like the Treaty of Versailles and not wanting to join the League of Nations, we kind of returned to isolationism. Now, this is like militarily speaking, but not necessarily dealing with, dealing with the economy. We still traded a lot, for example, but we were also involved in Latin America. We kind of saw this as like the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary. This is our part of the world. And so we were still sending troops into Nicaragua and Dominican Republic and Haiti, but we're trying to stay out of like European affairs, for example. Speaking of the military and foreign policy, we talked about kind of Wilson and his 14 points. Wilson wanted to reduce the size of the militaries to avoid another war. That was one of his 14 points. And so basically we came together at the Washington Conference in 1912, and we agreed the 5 major powers, England, France, America, Russia, we agreed to basically reduce the size, and Japan's in there as well, decided to reduce the size of our navies. And so basically the ratio of 5 major power ships. So for every 5 ships England has, America can have 5, Russia can have 3, and then France can have 1, Japan can have 1. And so we're reducing the number of ships and the Navy that people can have. Then we had the 4 power treaty, which we agreed to respect territory in the Pacific. Everybody's fighting over territory in the Pacific, and like who controls these little islands. And so we agree to respect that. And then the 9 power treaty, basically Belgium, China, France, US, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, we all wanted to basically have trade with China. And so we agreed to keep that open door policy from chapter 17, agreed to keep that going here. And then the last major thing with foreign policy is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is where 60 countries in the world signed a non-aggression pact. Basically, we agree not to use force. So they agreed not to invade other countries, not to attack other countries. They can defend themselves militarily, but they're not aggressively going to attack other nations. And these were all measures that were trying to reduce the size of militaries to prevent another World War I from breaking out. Of course, these are all going to fail, and we'll see World War II come about in 1939. But these are all attempts to reduce the size of the military and prevent future wars from happening. So the last major thing we'll talk about in the next video is going to be the start of the Great Depression. Thanks. Bye.